Why do you think that coastal communities is something you ended up studying?
Well, originally my idea was not necessarily to study coastal communities. I was more interested in regional development, which then lead into coastal communities. I've always been fascinated by the Arctic, different countries, different cultures, how people live in harsh environments, harsh settlements under difficult conditions. And probably I think back when I was 15, I started to be very, very interested in Siberia and all these remote places and how they made a living, how they were coping with changes. And so one thing led to another. I studied geography and social science to understand it a little bit better, and then started researching it more and more, and eventually coastal communities became a big theme of my research. I mean, this is not surprising considering the fact that I conduct most of my studies in Iceland. So sooner or later you definitely come across the ocean here.
You did your PhD assignment called Mapping Resilience. What was the subtitle again?
Coastal communities in Iceland.
Okay. What were you researching there?
I was looking into coastal communities in Iceland and how they changed, or what has changed since 1990, when individual transferable quotas were introduced in Iceland, which is a full privatization of fishing rights. That of course came with consequences for most fishing villages in Iceland. Some grew because they bought quotas. Some had socioeconomic difficulties because they lost quotas and lost the mainstay industry in the community. And I was looking into these changes and wanted to compare it, or I was pretty much motivated by my background or my origin, coming from an area that lost the steel mining industry, the coal mining industry, and I experienced structural change, socioeconomic, demographic structural change firsthand for the first 29 years of my life, and was very fascinated right from the start about how do people cope with change, how do they respond to change, and this is all in a way entangled in the concept of resilience. And this is something that is not necessarily bound to just a particular area. This is something that you can observe and research everywhere. So I think most of the things that I researched in this 4 years project can be transferred to other places as well. And so what was particularly interesting is that we have some 70, I think now it was 50 to 60 fishing communities in Iceland. And I think it must have been pretty clear that it will be difficult with privatization, that there will be centralization effects. And when you see the debate back in the days, people were quite aware that there might be centralization happening. We're very well aware of that, but there was no plan B developed in most communities. So I think some people were just thinking like, okay, we will try to keep the fisheries in town, we will make it somehow, and if not, well, we will see. But we will see is not the best concept for regional development or community development, and that was what I was looking into.
What's the benefit of using the concept resilience to look at Icelandic coastal communities? What does that give you? What advantages does that lens have versus maybe some of the others that have been used before?
Yeah, I deliberately decided to not take the concept sustainability. I mean, I didn't want to play the one concept against the other and say like sustainability is bad, resilience is awesome. I think both have their flaws, both have very good parts as well. And I think resilience helps a lot. I mean, the main question is how do communities, how do systems cope and react with change or external shocks, and which endogenous strategies are developed. And I think this fit exactly into what I wanted to research. What strategies are at these places? What are the main ideas people developed? And yes, the question is quite good because I had some problems also in the end, or I identified some problems with resilience in the end. It's a really good concept to explore exactly what I just described, but it has its flaws in terms of what if a place can be defined as non-resilient, what do we do then with this place? Another question is, what if the status quo before the change happened was not a good one? Do we want to go back to this particular stage? Then the system would be resilient, but the system that we had before the shock came was maybe not a good one, not a desirable one. So probably, just to come up with a very strange example, North Korea probably is a very, very resilient system. They are pretty much somewhat outside any kind of outside influence. They hardly care with external shocks. So we probably would consider it very resilient to global structures, global systems. But the system per se is, I think most people would agree, not a preferable one.
Okay, so a resilient system is only good insofar as the system itself is good.
Very difficult. I mean, this is something I do not necessarily want to say. I think the people in these places, in a way, this is also what I came up with the ideas of bottom-up strategies, endogenous strategies. In a way, the people there should, in a way, define themselves which kind of system or kind of structure they want to have. Of course, what we see in Iceland, it was very problematic, and the fishery system Iceland had was everything but resilient during the 70s, 80s, up to the 90s. The Black Report saying that cod fisheries, most important fisheries, were about to be overexploited. So this system was everything but sustainable, hence not really resilient, non-resilient, very vulnerable, if you want to say the opposite of resilience is vulnerability. So I think that was a big problem. So this system was everything but resilient. So then came another shock, I think, for these communities that were dependent on fisheries, so probably some sort of double shock. First, very little fish, then hardly any fish. So difficult to say. Very, very tough question, I would say.
So I was trying to explain in class the difference between using resilience and sustainability as ways to look at situations, and I must admit that they weren't very accepting of my explanations, and I had some difficulties explaining sustainability. So I know you don't want to put pit these two things together, but could you explain a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, sustainability, I think, would, in fisheries terms, it would be like to keep the source or to avoid overexploitation. Resilience would go one step ahead, I would say, and say, in case we do not manage or we fail with our approaches to sustainability, which can happen. So not every system is sustainable. Of course, the human influence in fisheries is quite big and causes the unsustainable handling. But I think, apart from that, not every system can be sustainable, I think. And resilience allows to go further and goes beyond the point where sustainability doesn't work any longer.
So is it fair to say that sustainability often describes the limits of a system, whereas resilience describes the system's ability to reinvent itself?
Yes, I would say so. And I think resilience starts or continues where sustainability stops. So this is why I wouldn't say that they are antagonistic and don't work well with it next to each other. I would always combine them to a certain extent. But sustainability stops well before resilience continues.
Okay, so we're very much in the abstract sense, which is good because you're a teacher and an academic. So that's fair enough. But some of these concepts that we're now applying for people who might not have all the background information about the Iceland's coastal communities and fisheries management and stuff, how would they apply to the last 40, 50 years in Iceland?
So the concepts that we just discussed.
So the resilience of fishing communities, the sustainability, could you kind of tell us a little bit about how you would use those concepts in the context of Icelandic fisheries communities?
Okay, so let's think about resilience. So it is the response to change and shock. When we consider overexploitation, lacking resources as a shock, no fish.
Too much fishing.
Too much fishing. How do we react? What do we do? There is no fish. Some places we're not able to fish any longer. It doesn't really matter if it's ecological reasons, social reasons. So let's say one place loses the ability to fish from one day to another, no matter the reason. We can define this as a shock for the social structure of a place, the employment structure of a place, so all kind of economic aspects as well. What happens then? Sustainability would, or we go back to the Icelandic example, and we had these places in Iceland. There were some 50 to 60 places that were heavily dependent on fisheries as a mainstay industry. I think the Regional Development Institute published some numbers a few years ago. 60 to 70, sometimes 80% of the working population of some communities were directly involved in the fisheries. And we talk about places that have 500 to maybe 2,000 inhabitants. They are all centered on this one resource. What happens if this resource is gone for whatever reason? This is where resilience starts. We look, what were the people, in this case, the communities, villages' responses to that? How do the locals respond to this change? How do they respond to the loss of the mainstay industry literally overnight? This is what I want to look into, or what I'm looking into at the moment.
And what did you find, or so far? How did they react to it? To put it a very blunt question, were they resilient, or were they not resilient, or something?
I mean, yeah, I was looking particularly into two communities. One that from the literature that I read beforehand, thought like they could be resilient, and some others another community that I thought might not be resilient, hence non-resilient or vulnerable. And it was case studies, but I tried to generalize a little bit. It's difficult to say. I think there are very, very many places in Iceland that are in a very dangerous state. And even though some of them still have a very well-working fisheries, they are still very, very dependent. And I think dependency is not increasing your resilience, because where we have places where fisheries are still a big thing, but just one company has the quotas. If they decide to leave, this place might face the same problems like other places did before. Overall, it's very difficult to say. I mean, we did some statistical analysis as well of the resilience or non-resilience of Iceland. So I took basically all the numbers of the past 27 years, or from 1990 to 2016, 17, and did a lot of number crunching and tried to find a way to assess resilience in statistical terms as well. And what we can see is like that the economic and demographic development of a place was very, very much dependent on fisheries in the 90s. But it got less during time. So fisheries are not that important any longer. But there are, of course, still places that are still very dependent. But I think some places either found a way, a different way out of the fisheries dependence, or they still have fisheries, but they were able to have industries next to it. And there are still places, I would say, we could easily name 20 places that are in very, very problematic situation. Like the policy that I analyze as well, the fragile communities from the Regional Development Institute. Currently, or no, I think since they started, there were 12 places in this program. And this already says something, that 11 out of 12 communities were fishing communities once, which I think is pretty much of a result that shows these places have problems and they were not coping well with the changes that we were confronted with in the 90s.